Hi, welcome to my Intonation Enriched. I'm calling it that because I have a series of 22 short videos about different intonation pitfalls as I see them, things you may not realize that are getting in the way of playing a tune. So for this video, it's much longer, but I'm going to go through each one and show it with quite simple examples. I'll also address something I didn't address in the initial series, which was the whole idea of different tunings, so-called expressive intonation, equal temperament, stuff like that. So the first one has to do with lateral motion. So lateral just means sideways. So if I go, so here, depending on your hand, for people with big hands, I might have small hands, but you might have to actually move the hand sideways to play that D sharp. Now I'm playing that a little high because it's the leading tone. And you can play it a little lower, but that's what that lateral motion is. And in one of my warm-ups on this channel, just a nice chromatic exercise going laterally. It's very good. The next one has to do with wrist pop. So sometimes when people use their fourth finger, they go, let me think, they go, see that? The wrist is popping out for the fourth finger, which makes it further away, and it's a terrible idea. So we want to make sure this is always nice and neutral. So watch out for the wrist pop. If it happens, you can gently poke it back into place. And like any problem we're trying to fix, you have to keep bringing your attention back to it. And I have a whole video about that and one about the focus flower that can help with that as well. Busy hand. So busy hand has to do with playing like this. So you're lifting too much, you're not keeping things down. We want to keep our fingers very close to the string and ready to go. Sometimes we want to leave our fingers down depending on what we're playing. But basically a quiet hand looks like this and a busy hand looks like that. Implied double stops. So implied means we're not actually playing double stop. So double stop is two notes at once. An implied double stop is, so I can check my G. Now find the B. Here's another example about intonation. So for me, the most important thing for playing the violin in tune is really matching everything to the open strings as much as possible. And you know, that is the most important thing. Now I put that B a little lower because it's the third of G major, but it's still sounding in tune as a fourth with my open E, which is the most important thing. When we play with a piano, it can sound a little out of tune because the piano is equal tempered. But if you avoid pushing things too far down or too far up in terms of the harmony, you can find a nice middle ground where everything is ringing nicely. So to me, that's the optimal. And I'll address that a little bit later in this video to do with perfect intervals and so on. The next one has to do with tritones. So the tritone is that funny sounding interval. It divides the octave in half. It's also called an augmented fourth or diminished fifth. And the thing to realize in terms of intonation is when we play it across the string, our fingers are very close. Sometimes we play it as an extension and then we have to reach. It's a different feeling in the hand. So recognizing tritones, they're often out of tune, is like half the battle. The next thing is not recording yourself. So people avoid recording themselves because they don't like what they hear back. But when you can get to the point that you hear a recording of yourself and it's exactly as you thought it was in the moment, particularly for intonation, that is a great moment because you know you're really hearing yourself. And that's incredibly important for players of all levels. And the next thing is pitch matching. So let's say I'm doing, so this G, we want to be the same each time. We can't leave it down, but we want to listen for that sameness. And sometimes even across a phrase, you have to make sure that the note you just played matches the one coming up. And then anticipating different hand positions. So this, you know, I mentioned the extension of the tritone. So anything that's a little weird, if we can anticipate it rather than just putting our finger down where it normally goes, that's going to help. And as you get more advanced, you do more extensions higher up, you do weirder chords, and that becomes even more important. But even a note like, let's say, so that D sharp is unexpected, and for beginners that's a note they're not used to playing, so just reaching, that aiming for that note, hearing it and feeling it before you play it is going to really help. And then I have knowing which position you're in. So, you know, when you're not shifting yet, it might seem not important, but very soon after you start playing, you'll start to shift. So I always ask my students this: do you know what position you're in? And, you know, they have to think, oh, is it second, is it seventh? So a fun thing to do, even when you're just starting, is to try to play something in different positions, even something, so I can play that in third position. What if I play it in second position? That's going to be 1, 2. And I have another video called Geography of the Fingerboard that takes you in 1 octave scales up, and you can do that with anything. And even if you're just starting out shifting, just to get used to even 1 finger patterns. One, two, you know, just getting used to what those are. Too many scales, different. So I'm just going according to my intonation pitfalls. So of course we need to practice scales, I believe, every day, but there's so many different patterns. So the more we can read new music, listen to different music, get different patterns in our ear. Often people are taken by surprise because there's just a slightly strange pattern. They're used to their fingers following a certain way. So I would say just exposing yourself to different styles and periods of music is super useful for helping your intonation. Then we have, I call this enjoy the view. This is very applicable when you're shifting, that when we get up high, we really go over the bit at the top. So I work in little repetitive loops into the tops of my scales and arpeggios, because those are often the hardest to play in tune. But even before you learn to shift, often there's like the high awkward bit that's, you know, we kind of avoid it. So just enjoy the view, you know, repeat that bit, work into some repetitions into your practice of that. Not practicing performance mode is incredibly important. Whether you're going to be performing in public or not, just being able to play through your piece without stopping and fixing. Because when we're practicing, we're in analytical mode. We're listening for mistakes, we're trying to correct them, trying different ways to go over things. But when we play through something and just get into the music, we have to let go, and they're completely different ways of thinking. So it's great in every practice session to set aside some time, even if it's just one part of something, one phrase, just say, this is performance mode. Ideally, you would record yourself or play for someone, but even just the mindset is going to really help you. And then, if things are out of tune, rather than stopping and fixing them, you just take note. Or if you record yourself, you take note afterwards. Oh, that was out of tune. And then you can go back into analytical mode and fix that problem. Then vibrato going above the note. So we always want our vibrato to go below, slightly below, never above. Sometimes when people vibrate a little wide, that can happen. Or if they just started doing it wrong, it'll roll. So we just want that feeling of always going below the note with vibrato. Then we have tension in the thumb and too much pressure. I think this is a big problem for intonation also because people can't fix quickly. So really great players, when they play slightly out of tune, they fix it so fast you don't even notice because they just make micro adjustments. But we always want to make sure that our thumb is nice and loose and that there's absolutely no gripping here. We want a nice, light, flexible feeling in the hand, and that will also help intonation. And yeah, I'll just add to that the angle that the fingers fall on the string. It's slightly different for every finger. Like the first finger is slightly to the left of the pad. It's a little more middle for the middle finger, and the ring finger's a little straighter. So in terms of finding a nice hand position, if you have those angles correct, that can help make a nice tunnel shape, a nice fan open shape, which will help your intonation. And then awareness of weird finger placements. This has to do mostly with chords. We just have to, you know, so what I just said goes out the window, right? Our fingers are going to fall in very strange ways to play chords. And, you know, I have a separate video about that. just giving examples of chords. Now, the next thing has to do with a approach to the note. This is, to me, is one of the main issues. Is people, they hear it's out of tune, they fix it on the fly, but they don't fix how they got there, right? Whether it's a shift or just putting your finger down, we have to aim correctly. So let's say I'm going along, oh, that was sharp, right? But I don't want to go, I want that to fall correctly. So you have to just always back up, like rewind, get that approach to the note. And then not warming up. So, you know, I'm in my 50s. As we get older, things get a little stiff, and I notice I have to warm up more than I used to when I was younger. But anyone, you know, you're cold or whatever, you haven't played, and you start playing and you're like, oh, so out of tune today, and you kind of give up and put the violin away. Well, make sure you have a really nice warm-up routine. Maybe put your hands in warm water, but do some nice warm-up exercises. On this channel, I have a whole series of different warm-ups that I do myself, and maybe explore those. They're my unique warm-ups, and they could be interesting to try, and they're very short, but they really warm up the hand. Contractions. So we talked about extensions. A contraction is when like your hand goes from being open to being closed, and also like half position, like chromatic things. So those are like, it's contracting, it's going in. So it has to do with the awareness of that, should help. And then neglecting perfect intervals. This is another major pitfall. So what are the perfect intervals? We tune in fifths. Those are pure perfect intervals. They really only sound good one way. Octaves. It's really obvious when octaves are out of tune. We avoid octaves. So in this example, this is across a string, so it's harder to check. But if I play it slightly out of tune, it's terrible. And the other perfect interval is fourths. Fourths are often neglected. So actually in this example, there's a fourth. So again, if it's slightly out of tune, it's very uncomfortable. And the last perfect interval is a unison, which just means the same note. We don't play those as often, but they're good to be aware of. So the A, fourth finger, open string. As you get more advanced, we have to extend to unisons, which are uncomfortable, and then you really hear if it's out of tune. So when you're practicing intonation, you want to recognize those fourths, fifths, and octaves and make sure they're really well in tune. And as I mentioned before, we have a little wiggle room with the thirds, sixths, sevenths. So there's kind of some harmonic rules. So let's say I'm playing a dominant seventh chord. So that's the fifth degree of the scale. If I'm in G major, the D is the dominant, is the fifth degree. That's a D major arpeggio. If I add the seventh, that makes it dominant seventh. Very common chord. So for my ears, the F sharp sounds better, a little lower. Not too high. Sometimes people play it too high because they're reaching for the G. It's the leading note in G. But the C, there's that crunchy tritone again. We want that a little bit low so it has that resolution down to the G. So again, like with these intervals, there are different ways to tune them, and depending what group you're playing in, what key you're in, it's good to learn a little bit of awareness about that stuff. But perfect intervals, we want to make sure we know about them. Driving on the shoulder, to me, this is another major pitfall. So what happens is someone gets a little bit off. So I'll give an example. Let's say I'm going, let's say, so I got sharp there. And then I play the open D and I realize it's really out. So we always want to check with our open string. Fourth. And if we're playing in a weird key and there are no, like, not a weird key, but a key where there aren't, with, you know, like E major, A flat major, where there's too many sharps and flats to check our open strings, we can use a drone tuner. I have an app I really like called Drone Tuner where they've sampled natural sounds. You can just have a nice cello playing along with you and you can check. So if you tend to get off on this weird note like this G sharp, have a G sharp playing and tune that little spot to that, so you're really zeroing in on that. And when you record yourself, if you hear yourself getting off, you may not hear when you get off, but you might hear when you play the next open string that you really got off. And this particularly happens when you start to shift a lot. People shift slightly off, slightly sharp or flat, and then they really start driving on that shoulder and they don't get back on the road. So a good one to be aware of. Couple more of these pitfalls, two more. One is not understanding the priority note. So that has to do with double stops. So we normally tune to the lower note of a chord, unless the upper note is an open string or it matches an open string, or we were already playing it. But 85% of the time you just need to really think about the lower note. And that's important to realize because sometimes people are playing out of tune. Let's say they're playing this third, it's out of tune, they can't figure it out, so they start moving around both notes. They just can't find their way. So no, we've tuned to the lower note. In this case, I'll check my G and I'll find the B. And whether we're playing the strings together or not, as I mentioned before, it might be an implied double stop. It's still important to know which note we're tuning to, what's the priority note. And the last one has to do with chromatics. So chromatics comes from a Greek word meaning color, and it's the semitones. So it's really important to practice chromatic scales at whatever level you're at. Even for beginners, if you just do and I have a separate video about that in my violin beginner playlist showing more of that. And as soon as you can really start to practice chromatic scales regularly with different fingering patterns, it just makes it that you're better at them. We want pretty even semitones, and we want to make sure that nothing gets in the way of the open strings being in tune. So I often find with chromatic passages, someone's going along, then they have, and they play slightly too close or slightly too far, and it just takes them off the path of good intonation. So I hope this was useful. Maybe I didn't go into depth enough with some things. I always appreciate feedback. So let me know if this was helpful to you and if you have any suggestions for different videos.